Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. As part of our series on local government, we are interviewing a series of local government leaders. Tonight we speak to Hugh Thomas, the Labour councillor for the Spot Ward and leader of Cardiff Council since 2017. Hello, Hugh.
Hello, Matt.
Thank you very much for coming to talk to us. Often we hear in the media about the issues that impact UK or Welsh governments, but we rarely hear, I think, a lot about what's impacting local government. So to you, what are some of the major challenges being faced by the local governments across Wales at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and thanks for having me on. And that's a great first question, and I think it makes a good point in the question, actually, that there is a bit of a deficit in terms of information, in terms of what the media covers as far as local government is concerned. And more often than not, the media attention only comes to local government when something is going wrong, which we obviously try and avoid. So what's happening then? I mean, funding, I think, continues to be a source, an ongoing source of concern or challenge. Your listeners will be aware of the public sector austerity that local government has been enduring for over a decade. And in Wales, to a certain degree, we've been protected to a greater extent than councils in England and Scotland, albeit the Welsh government, absolutely in line with their manifesto priorities, have been prioritising health. So to give people a scale of what austerity has meant in the case of Cardiff, we've made savings of around £250 million over the last decade through public sector austerity. Now, the current budget settlement for the forthcoming financial year is unique, certainly in my time as a councillor. I was first elected in 2012, in that it actually provides positive budget growth over and above the pressures that certainly Cardiff is facing. So that's the first time we've had that kind of budget growth in the last 9 years, and hugely welcome. But of course, what we are not certain of is what the state of that will be in the medium term. There's definitely a strong suspicion out there, particularly if somebody like Rishi Sunak becomes Prime Minister, that we will face another period of public sector spending cuts. And there is no fat left in local government now. You look across Wales, you'll have stories of service cuts and reduced provision. So it is a pretty lean machine. So that is one certainly area of challenge and concern. And then obviously, we are, I hope, coming out of COVID now. But I think that brave new world is one I think that we are still seeking to understand. What is the future of the world of work, and how does that work, not just in relation to how councils operate, but frankly to how city centres and town centres work. If Welsh Government have stated, haven't they want to see 30% of people working from home from now on, don't have an issue with that policy per se. And I think reducing traffic volumes is a good thing. But that means we have to rethink, in my view, how city centres and town centres operate. There's an unfair playing field when it comes to business rates, when you compare your local high street with online shopping. So what will central government do around that? And what is the impact then of that, or any failure to address that, on the vibrancy of the areas that we govern as local councils? So yeah, probably ongoing funding, and what does a renewal post-COVID look like? Those are probably the two main issues flagging red. And linked to the second one, obviously, is the cost of living crisis in Cardiff. And I'm taking a long time to answer this question, Matt. This may be the feature of the podcast, right? In Cardiff, we've got stated ambitions around tackling inequality, and I'm sure we'll talk tonight about some of the work we've been doing as a council to that end. We control some pretty limited levers, frankly, when it comes to addressing inequality, compared with what people have to spend their household bills on, and compared to the levers open to Welsh government, certainly UK government. So we all see it coming down towards us as a tsunami in terms of rising costs of living. And I'm genuinely worried how that will play out, not just in places that are already grappling with poverty, but actually for working families as well. Obviously, Cardiff Council will do everything that we can to support, but we're not going to be able to do that on our own.
We'll get back to levers in a second, Hugh, but we'll tackle funding first. So it's been a major issue, like you say, for local government for the past decade and perhaps more. But I think this has been brought again into sharp focus, really, with the process related to the shared prosperity funding and other EU replacement funds, How would you describe that process for yourselves in local government, and sort of what impact has it had on local government funding levels?
I mean, not straightforward is probably the easiest way I can characterise it. It's a slightly different situation in Cardiff's case to some other local councils. So given Cardiff's access to Objective 1 money as was fairly limited, there hasn't been maybe as direct an impact on the funding of some ongoing projects, albeit there are examples I could point to you. So, we have an interwork service actually that's hugely successful, operating out of our community hubs in linking up people looking for work, providing them with some training and skills, kind of supplementing and maybe with a more human face what the DWP does, with actually a really strong track record of getting those people into employment then. And that was a programme in receipt of European funds. So local government leaders had a call with Michael Gove in the last few weeks, and I raised this point with him personally, that we are still waiting confirmation for successor funds to that programme, and we're still waiting. And I think, frankly, where we'll end up is the council will have to make the choice to fund that programme itself. So still waiting, I think, is how I'd characterise the money coming down the line to replace EU funds. It is certainly not the kind of, not a powerless, not a penny lost mantra that Welsh Government had been setting as the challenge to UK government. And, the Levelling Up Fund, it's a great tagline, but I think we're still waiting to see what it means in reality. One of the things that struck me as to, how funds were distributed in the first round, Cardiff wasn't successful in its bid to upgrade the Cardiff market. We'd gone with that because it was a shovel-ready project in the city centre, all about attracting people back into the city centre post-COVID. A couple of million, wasn't successful. There is certainly not, it's not complementary in terms of the projects I'm seeing funded with Welsh Government strategy, and feels pretty piecemeal, not targeted in a particular way to alleviate poverty, for example, in a way that myself and other Labour councils, Labour politicians may want to see. It feels like it'll be a good way for a Conservative government to say, here's 10 million or 20 million that we are pumping in the direction of this particular constituency. At the moment, certainly lacks a strategic overview.
One of the allegations about this funding is it's forcing local governments to compete against each other for the same pots of money. How do you think that compares to previous systems and how money was allocated to local governments before from this basically what is successor EU funding?
I don't know. I mean, look, a bit of competition is good because it focuses minds and, frankly, does weed out projects that don't need funding. And I think if we're going to be critical and honest, we would have to look at some of the projects that got funded through European Union funding, ask the question, what difference did they make? And I'm asking that, with a challenging mindset, because some of the areas in receipt of the greatest amount of EU funding in Wales were also the ones that voted most heavily for Brexit. So what, what's gone wrong there? What's the disconnect? I just mentioned your last question about this lack of kind of strategic overview, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, really, when it comes to kind of that competition element, because the way each local authority thus far, certainly in Wales, responded to levelling up opportunity was on an individual basis. Everybody put their own bid in, quite often with a shovel-ready project that they were finding money, they were going to try and find money for anyway, and it was ready to go, and this was a good way of getting it funded, as opposed to a more kind of coherent regional approach, or at least partnering approach of here's a regional scale project that is in the benefit of our local authority and a neighbouring local authority to get delivered together. We're going to bid together. That's not happened yet. I'm not saying it never will, but I think some moves to give a bit more coherence to what the government is trying to achieve through the Levelling Up Fund, I think would be necessary to push local authorities in the main to work in that way.
You talk about working with other local authorities. What is your view on the future role of city deals, regional partnerships, organisations such as the Western Gateway, and even the much questioned CJCs in the future of local government in Wales?
I mean, the first thing to say is actually my experience of regional working in South East Wales on the Cardiff Capital Region City deal has been remarkably positive. I mean, I really do think that needs saying. And, you've got 10 authorities there, 2 Tory, or one changed colours midway through, 2 independent, 6 Labour, Valleys, City, M4 corridor. So a real mix. And in the main, over the last 5 years, we've made it work, and personal relationships have certainly played a part. But I think, there has been a shared sense of purpose forged, and kind of, an appreciation. Okay, just because an investment goes into Newport doesn't mean that's bad for Cardiff, or doesn't that mean that's bad for Caerphilly. There's always a little bit of tension. People want money spent on patch, but I think I've certainly described the experience as positive in the main. My concern with regional working, and this is not a reason to not do it, but I think it's a reason to go into it with your eyes open, is that you are further removing not just backbench councillors, but actually also the people that they represent, ordinary people, from the decision-making process, right? So the City deal is made up of a joint cabinet of the 10 leaders of the authorities, and that is the ultimate decision-making body. So there is political accountability, but it's still through that one person reporting back. The way City deal has been constituted, and the way we seem to be moving on corporate joint committees, and this is probably my biggest fundamental issue with CJCs, even though I think they've got a role to play, is that it essentially operates on a one member, one vote basis. So I, as the leader of Cardiff, 365,000 people, have the same weight around that table as a leader of an authority that's maybe a quarter of the size. And I think, to me, that suggests that, something of a democratic deficit. However, that's how it's been constructed. That's what we've got to work within. I do think there are certainly projects that are of regional significance and that require regional working. The idea of a kind of strategic regional plan, for example, I think is well made. Likewise, a strategic transport plan, and that builds on the work that regional transport consortia within City Deal was doing. And I think CJCs could also give local authorities a tool on a different footprint as well. So education is in the mix, and the footprint of the education consortia are different to the footprint of City Deal as is. So there could be some interesting options there as well. And you mentioned Western Gateway then, Matt. And to me, the advantage or the strength something like that brings is, one, recognising the economic reality that, particularly between Cardiff, Newport and Bristol, there is an awful lot of commuting, people working in those different cities, and also some pretty good synergies in terms of the economies of those areas. But actually, both South East Wales and the South West miss out to significant levels on UK government spending, particularly when it comes to infrastructure. Bristol and Cardiff will both take an economic hit because of High Speed 2, for example. Now, I'm not opposed to High Speed 2. I think it's an important investment in the rail network of that part of the country, but not at the expense of investment in South Wales. I think it is an absolute nonsense, an absolute disgrace even, that there's no Barnet consequential of that project, because Cardiff and surrounding areas are going to be disadvantaged. And if you're the leader of Manchester or the leader of Leeds, of course you're going to be talking effusively about the advantages that HS2 brings to those cities. And what we are saying and using Western Gateway really as a leverage to louden our voices, saying we need equivalent funding from central government into this corner.
Are you in favour of local government reform, in the way that we traditionally envisage it, changing the number of councils in Wales?
At the danger of making myself unpopular with fellow leaders, I'm not opposed to it. No, and when this was mooted before CJCs, I think it was back in the day when Alan Davis was minister. I think Cardiff was more open to it than most.
It's viewed as one of these sort of Welsh political third rails, though, isn't it? It's you touch it and you lose your ministerial career. So how would the Welsh government go about doing this? There is a feeling that it would have to be a sort of bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. But we've been talking about this now for however long these councils have been in existence, so it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere with that process. So, from your eyes, if a Welsh government minister was to go about this process, how would they have to do it?
Well, what's funny is that they almost got there. Welsh Government, I think it was with the proposals that came forward with Leighton Andrews. I think it was kind of 2016, where in particular expressions of interest for voluntary mergers were considered. And I think you did have 2 or 3 examples of councils jointly together coming forward to accept merging together. And actually, even on that scale, reducing from 22 to around 18, where some of the very small councils merged together, I think even that would clean things up a little bit. And that's not. Let me be clear. Let me be clear before I pull the house down on myself in local government families. I think if I was a leader of a small council, I would say there are plenty of good examples of stuff that we do better than big councils. And I think that's fair. But I think I'm also seeing examples where small councils don't have the scale to achieve what they need to achieve. So you're either going to have to collaborate regionally, and I guess that's what's happening instead, or you merge. Jury's out, I think, and we'll see how it plays out over the next 5 years on whether CJCs becomes the vehicle for really deep collaboration.
So the other way you could reform local government, of course, is by giving more power to local government. Do you think that would be the right thing to do? And are there any areas in which you think you would have benefited from having greater powers in Cardiff Council? Yeah,
definitely. And the old line is that devolution stopped in Cardiff Bay. I'm not saying that even critically, I think that reflects just the journey that devolution in Wales has been on. But I think generally on a UK level, and England and Scotland as well, we are a very centralised country, and where devolution happens, it then devolves to a centralised devolved body. I mean, the area I would draw particular attention to is tax raising powers, right? So if you look at the majority of cities in Europe or North America, I'm talking cities, they retain as much as 50% of tax base within those areas. In the UK, the figure is more like 7%. So, I was talking earlier about the levers councils have to affect change. But when you only control 7% of your tax take, as opposed to 40, 50%, by definition, your levers are going to be more restricted. There's been some talk about tourism tax as one of those levers. I certainly think that's something to be looked at, where that is controlled and levied locally. All sorts of issues about VAT in that mix. So it's not straightforward. But even that, as a limited local levying ability, is touching at the edges really of what else could be done.
I mean, in England, for example, they've had the creation of the metro mayors, which has brought together sort of broader powers and more powerful figurehead figures. Do you think that system could ever work in Wales?
I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be made to work in the same way that it's been made to work in England. But I actually think that the picture of devolution in England is a pretty messy one. You don't have to look very far to see examples of where there's a metro mayor figurehead, and one of the areas where they really do succeed is getting some media attention, often because they're former MPs and the London lobby journalists know who they are, but they're able to draw attention to themselves. But then in terms of their actual delivery capability, that still rests with the local councils that sit beneath them. And more often than not, they've got very different agendas. So to take a recent, if you look at Bristol and west of England, until last May's election, when the Metro Mayor became a Labour politician, you had a Conservative Metro Mayor there who had basically been elected on a campaign in opposition to Bristol, right? So it was the surrounding countryside around Bristol voting for him, contrary to the agenda of the mayor of Bristol, which doesn't seem to me to be a clever way of establishing devolved regional government either.
Let's move on to the upcoming election here. So in the last election in 2017, there was a turnout of around 42%. So late with, and this is Kerry from our parish here with the facts and figures here. So correct me if I'm wrong at any point. But he says in this question that Labour took control of Cardiff with about 20% of the eligible votes in Cardiff. I mean, that's fine. It's the system we have. You can only win the votes that people cast. But do you have any concerns about sort of level of engagement in local politics in Cardiff and how that can be worked on to improve turnout in the upcoming election?
I mean, I'd like everybody to vote, and I'd like everybody to vote for me. So that would be very nice. We spoke right at the start of the conversation about what the media covers, and I think there are a couple of misunderstandings out there about what councils do, what councils can do, and who runs them. None of that supports greater turnout, I'm afraid. I've heard criticism of the way Cardiff Council, for example, engages with people and talks about what it's doing. Well, our Twitter account, for example, has got 100,000 followers by now. That's nearly a third of the entire population of the city. So we have good outreach, but people still need to turn up at the ballot boxes. And let's be blunt as well. There are some parties who benefit from lower turnout and voter suppression. I'm horrified by some of the legislation working its way through Westminster at the moment in terms of voter ID and whatnot. I think that is anti-democratic, and that will suppress exactly the type of voter who needs to participate in democracy to improve their own lot, and who don't engage with democracy in great numbers already as it is. As a council, there's a statutory responsibility on the council to see annual voter registration. We get 90% returns actually on that canvassing in the main. That's positive, but then people still need to turn up at the ballot box. And I do think there's a little bit of taking personal responsibility as well, as active citizens. So I think that democracy relies on that.
You reminded me to send back my letter to register to vote. Thank you very much. This is, of course, the first local government elections in Wales where 16 and 17-year-olds will be able to vote. What kind of work are Cardiff Council doing to engage younger voters now that they're allowed to vote for the first time?
So there've been some specific campaigns. I don't know if you've seen them run in particular through the youth service, just to raise awareness and encourage participation, and some competitions around that as well. And I know that a number of schools are doing particular targeted work as well. And I imagine lots of local councils will be very keen in the next few weeks to get into their secondary schools and do a talk about what it's like being a councillor and all the good stuff that they've done. So there's a FIFA programs underway.
Yeah, so we interviewed recently Anthony Slaughter and Rhys Owen about the Plaid and Green Common Ground Alliance. What has your assessment been of this alliance and other opposition parties as we head into the election? Do you think that they are ready to put up a good fight, or are you confident of keeping hold of the authority after May?
I'm absolutely taking nothing for granted, Matt, as you would expect me to do, and we will be fighting for every seat. And Welsh Labour, Cardiff Labour, I've got a really good story to tell in terms of what's been delivered, not just over the last 5 years, but actually over the last 10 years. And I could point you towards some real horror stories in terms of the council that was inherited from the last Lib Dem Plaid administration in 2012. In education, for example, and I think the council's moved on enormously since then. So, yeah, in terms of you asking about my assessment of the opposition, I largely don't tend to pay them much attention. I focus on what we're doing ourselves. But the only active campaign I've seen from the Common Ground Alliance, or whatever they're calling themselves, has been in Llandaff North. Now, at the moment, you've got in Llandaff North a Labour councillor of who's from Bangladeshi origin, and a young female councillor, and you've got a Common Ground Alliance of two white men looking to replace them. That doesn't feel to me like a new way of doing politics.
Obviously, this is the first election now we're fighting under the new boundaries. What sort of impact has that had on your party's ability to organise? Has it given you new impetus, or is it taken a little bit of adjusting to?
I mean, I think we're a bit frustrated, frankly, that it took so long to get the process done. Clearly impacted by COVID, so I'm not complaining massively, but it did mean that some selections were taking place later than I would have liked. I think it's really good that places like Newtown and Grangetown have had, the number of councillors increased. We had a absolutely ridiculous situation in Bhutan where you had a single councillor representing 8,000 electors, and you compare that with other parts of Wales where a councillor can represent 400 electors. So long overdue, but now fixed. Clearly, there's some growth in the north of the city as well, which reflects the house building that's been going on there, and the Labour. So I think those areas will be really interesting because, let's remember, most of the parties opposed the creation of those areas. So we'll be interested to see how those areas end up voting. But it's all to play for, and I think the Boundary Commission ultimately got to a sensible position.
So thank you very much for coming to talk to us. I'm going to leave you one nice big opportunity now to sell Cardiff Labour ahead of the elections. So I just want you to go through some of what you think have been your greatest achievements in your time as leader, and if there's anything you think you could have done better and will seek to improve on next time around.
It's been an absolute pleasure being leader of the council. It's a job like no other, and it's a real position to get stuff done. Clearly, COVID has disrupted some of our work, and as you'd imagine, a lot of the focus of the last 2 years has been about protecting, people in real need, and I'm immensely proud of the way the council and our staff responded to that need. I've said publicly, I'm sure the council has saved lives, just like the NHS over the last 2 years. But I think when I look particularly at the policies that we've delivered and the things that give me most pride, probably the two standout areas is education and housing. So we're in the middle of probably the biggest rebuilding job of Cardiff schools that the city has ever seen, starting with schools, secondary schools in the southern arc of the city, in particular the area with the highest levels of deprivation. And we are creating beacons, frankly, of educational excellence. You look at Easton High, you look at Cardiff West. These were places that a few years ago people did not want to go to, that have now got competition because people want to get in and get to them because they see the changes that we've made. I visited Fitzallen last week for the topping out of the new school there, and what a difference, from a building that is literally in danger of falling down to, world-class modern facilities. And there are, 3 more schools, secondary schools already going through the process, as part of what my administration has done over the last 5 years. And if we're elected, and Welsh Government, this is in part a Welsh Government programme as well, the commitment is there to continue this work through other parts of the city. So that rebuilding work, alongside the focus on educational excellence, like I mentioned, when Labour took over the council in 2012, education was on the verge of special measures. Essin had been in for a full inspection in 2011, and we were in Essin monitoring. Really dire stuff. A large number of schools in kind of the red categories. We've just come out of an Essin inspection now, just before Christmas. A world of difference, and really strong performance academically across our schools as well. And that's because year on year we've given, despite the funding challenges, we've put more money into schools. We've delegated more money to schools. We've got the support mechanisms rights in terms of what the county provides, the local education authority provides into schools. And then we've invested in the school estate, like I was talking about as well. So a huge difference, and nothing captures that better for me than when you look at the numbers of kids leaving school at 16, what is their future progression? So under Lib Dem Plaid, this is going back 15 years, but you had as many as 1 in 10 kids at 16 leaving school without a destination into employment or educational training. That figure is now down to less than 2 in 100 under Labour. So that's a difference for me a Labour administration can make. And then there's the housing stuff. We've built more council houses in the last 2 years than in the previous 2 decades. That's because, enabled by a Welsh Labour government, we took the decision to suspend right to buy and crack on and build council housing. So by the end of this calendar year, we will, over the course of 5 years, have built 1,000 council houses. Our ambition going into the next term is to build a further 1,500 and actually have the council itself operating as a developer in some of the cases where we also build private sector housing. We sell that often on an affordable basis to first-time buyers, but the profit then gets recycled to allow us to build more council housing. And we all know about the pressures on the housing system, the people on the waiting list. There is no better solution to that than building houses, and that's what Labour in charge of Cardiff Council have done. And if we continue in charge of Cardiff Council, that's what we will do.
Good, Thomas. Thank you very much for coming on.
Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thanks for having me.
And if you've enjoyed what you've heard now or in any of our other episodes, please do not forget to find us on Twitter and Facebook at HeroivePod, or on our brand new shiny website, www.walespolitics.com. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate and review.